Hi, this is my review of Heroines of the First Age. This is a role-playing game with a strong focus on storytelling, world building, and creating interesting characters with strong relationships, and you can see how they develop alongside the changes in the world around them. This is powered by the Apocalypse. This is actually my first experience with a powered by the Apocalypse role-playing game. Now, let's talk about the quality of the PDF. This is also available as print on demand. So if you want the physical book, you can get it like that as well. I will be receiving the physical book in probably a couple of weeks. And when I get it, I will show it to you so you can decide if you want to get it as a PDF or as a physical book or as both. When you purchase the PDF, you get several files. You have a game prep sheet. It's very useful because it has all the essentials to play a session of Heroines of the first stage. You also have handouts and a game master screen completely free. It even comes with images to build your own game master screen. You also have a list of archetype and character moves, and a character sheet, of course, and the main rulebook. The rulebook has bookmarks and hyperlinks in the table of contents, in the index, so it's going to be quite easy to navigate the entire PDF. Now let me talk about the graphic design and the illustrations. Well, if some of you may remember my review of Oubliette, also by Void Spiral Entertainment, and in Oubliette I was really pleased with the artwork. This is probably some of the best, perhaps even the best anime type or manga type artwork that I've seen in a Western type of role-playing game. I am quite critical of such like anime or manga themed games. Like, for example, I really like OVA and Valor, but the anime art style, it was kind of good at times, and other times I feel like it missed quite a bit. But this art by Joseph Lee Bush, it's pretty awesome, pretty amazing. Joe, you did a really good job with the illustrations. And you have this like watercolor effect on each page, and you can almost feel like the colored water moving around the different pages. So the graphic design is excellent. And everything is so easy to read. The font is really easy on the eyes. This is one of those books that you start to read and suddenly you already read like 20 pages and you didn't even notice. So the quality overall is excellent, superb, and I couldn't spot a single typo. So just wonderful, excellent quality. So what is this game about? If you enjoy manga, anime, or just epic fantasy games, you're going to love the theme of this game. It feels like they combine so many different things in mythology and fiction. That is, think about Beowulf, perhaps Hercules, the Enuma Elish, Gilgamesh, and combine it with anime or manga, like for example Everyday Life with Monster Girls, or basically any anime or manga that features sort of like supernatural female characters with extraordinary powers. Heroines of the First Stage is a wonderful combination of all of that. This game can be played following that style of story, that is creating female warriors or conquerors or wizards or whatever you like, that participate in this huge world. It could be a multi-dimensional setting, and it feels like the building blocks of creation have just appeared. It is an age of discovery and the creation of great empires in its most primordial sense. This setting feels a bit like the time before time existed. It's really weird, very surreal. So if you like stories, it's sort of like, for example, those stories in Lovecraft where a character managed to get some visions or glimpses of the past where things were just beginning, of civilizations that were created and lost, and worlds and races that were came into being and suddenly disappeared, and some others replaced them. This is that type of game. You could play it as, for example, an action comedy if you wanted to, or a romantic comedy in the style of the anime that this game uses as inspiration, but it doesn't need to be played like that. You could play it as a very serious thing, and you could play it if you don't like to play with heroines, although I would recommend that you do that because that is the tradition of this particular style, or something completely different. The choice is up to you. But it could basically be a combination of anything that you can imagine. You can play a sort of like an action romantic comedy with drama and tragedy. It could be played as anything that you can think of. Although, my personal recommendation, I would play it a bit like an action comedy. When it comes to the basics, this game teaches you how to play a role-playing game more on the storytelling side of things. Each player character has 5 parts. It has vitals that describe your character's appearance and basic traits, and you have your primary stats, that is your base abilities. You also have secondary stats. This could be how experienced or tough your character is, your relationships with others. You also have moves that feel a bit like special powers or abilities or maneuvers. It has to do with the mechanics of the game and how your character affects the world around her. And you also have equipment, of course. It could be weapons, armor, even resources. This is a game where you could have armies. You could lead armies into battle and it will flow really smoothly, really easy to play. And when it comes to the game master, that is also called as the Fate at times, the game master follows a few simple things, such as an agenda, that is the why of running the game, the principles, the ins and outs on how to run the game, and he also has the game master moves. These are tools that you can use to make some sense between your agenda and principles. And you also have adversaries, of course, non-player characters that present challenges to the player characters. The game master has quite a bit of ease when it comes to how he's going to participate in the game. That is a lot of things have been designed so that there is little work for the game master involved in the mechanical sense, and he can focus more on the story, on the connections between the different characters, the issues and threats and things that could happen in the game world. So if you're a game master that sometimes feels a bit with a bit too much of a burden on both the creative and mechanical side of things, this is a game that is more like a collaboration between game master and players. You also have an example of play, communicating the theme quite excellently. And then we start out learning about the genesis process. You start out creating an entire world or setting in just a few hours. You have all the tools to accomplish that. Of course, you could polish it even more, but all of the process here, it's quite easy and fast to come up with some original or really cool mixed ideas of what you want the world to be. So you come up with some assumptions. Do humans exist in this setting? Or maybe at first they were only like beings of the fairy or monsters or demons or gods. And you can decide on the technology level. Maybe you want to handle things as Stone Age or Bronze Age, Iron Age, or maybe it's a Magic Age. It could be anachronistic. It could also be somewhat of a future in the past or science fantasy type of setting if you wanted to. And then you define the metaphysics, that is the magic and the spirituality in the setting. This could concern auras and halos. Maybe magic is fueled by some sort of material known as the ether. Or maybe everything is powered by the spirits of the land. Or maybe there is some sort of natural law or higher principle governing those things that come into being miraculously so. We also have the power pools. Power pools are great portfolios or entities or domains that inhabit the world and impregnate the entire world all around them. They feel a bit like the Force. So you have different types of power pools. The group decides between 2 and 3 power pools. For example, you have the Everblood. This concerns vitality, the cycle of life, tyranny and sex. But you could also have river dragons. This could be a sort of force of water, of disasters, of floods, or a great bounty. Or there could be something like the ink, which is purple, black, writing, knowledge, communication, immortality. These power poles determine the sort of like magic or miracles that can be carried out in the game. They could also be antagonistic, but they basically represent a pool that you can call upon in moments of great importance at your own risk. So coming into contact with these pools could result, perhaps, for example, in madness or corruption or just some sort of physical injury. And this doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have complicated mechanics related to each of these pools. It could be handled as a bit of like from a narrative standpoint. And then we have regions. You can create any type of region. You usually create 3 or 4 regions, and you can name them using descriptors and environment words. So for example, maybe in your particular setting, you have the cosmic desert, or the storm lake, or the fungal jungle. So you can come up with some really nice ideas, and these words are just inspirational for you to come up with your own type of regions and terrains and zones. And then we have information on other things, such as, for example, the culture. You can name a specific culture, determine the size. Maybe it's a tribe, or maybe it's a city, or even an empire. You determine what type of dogma, the influence of such culture, the deities and creation myths concerning that culture. And you have some words to come up with some interesting ways on how this particular culture is being governed or led around. Maybe there is some sort of oath of service, or maybe it's actually like an anarchy, and they are also quite militaristic at the same time in some respects. Or maybe it's a monarchy, and it's quite isolationist because of some shame of the past, or perhaps related to some xenophobia issues. You also have different examples of gods. Maybe there is a god known as Nemes, which concerns the guidance of death. Or maybe it's the avatar of the ink, a sort of like power related to writing, knowledge, civilization. Or there could be a Velica, which is the mother of monsters. That's a bit like Shub Nigurad. It feels kind of like that. And then we have the creation myths. So maybe everything was brought upon by the blood of the thinker. Prior to that which is, was someone to imagine it existing. That primordial thinker saw all that would ever be and tried to kill itself in fear. And this is just a small background of that particular creation myth. There are many creation myths here. So for example, we have the creation myth of In a Bottle. Everything we know and see is the design of a truly grand creator who made the world by mixing equal parts water, dirt, and life in a bottle in his laboratory. Or maybe all is one. There is only one thing that exists, and that is the goddess. We are the momentary thoughts of the goddess as she contemplates existence. Or maybe the entire setting is just drifting between other worlds, perhaps without a sense of purpose, and you need to find that purpose. There are just many ways in which you can use these creation myths to come up with your own things as inspiration. You also have immediate threats. So how does this threat affect the world and the characters and non-player characters? And you also have creature portfolios. When you create enemies and non-player characters, you can come up with any sort of creature that you can think of or that you have seen in fiction, mythology, anime, manga, etc. But here you have some useful portfolios. For example, you have the benthic ones. From the depths of the sea, they come to gorge on the bounty of the land. Or maybe you have the Gyga's army. These mountain vast titans can wipe clean the lands of their enemies quite literally. Or maybe you have the sky things. They come from the far side of the sky, and their hideously alien forms are nothing but nightmares to us. You also have information on rising villains. Maybe there is Tethifar, the matriarch of the Dark Pride. Or maybe you have Dahaoth, the Phobomancer. Or maybe you have Izobram, the Stalker in the Dark. Or maybe you have Raza, the Dancer in Flames. And then you have information on looming prophecies. Maybe there is some sort of cataclysm or apocalypse soon to happen. So, for example, maybe this world will soon be awash in blood, and all shall fall, making way for the next world. Or maybe there's a disaster that will come to all tribes equally, except to some chosen ones. Or maybe, as soon as all the nations are one, all shall fall. This is very cryptic, and you can come up with your own looming prophecies using these prophecies as inspiration. You also have information on intervening gods. You can use them however you like. Maybe you have the Crow, which is the blood drinker. Or you have Heldor, who sunders what is wrath. Or maybe you have Aelgrim, the god of war and vengeance. Then you have information on major discoveries. After all, this is the first age, Heroines of the first age. It's all about that primordial event when everything came into being, when everything was full of possibilities. So maybe there's magic of the flesh, or maybe there exists some sort of thing like star metal. Maybe people are just discovering geomancy, or maybe there's a new class of weapon, or they have discovered some truths about blood. And then you have world problems. Maybe there is an ongoing war or a succession war. Maybe it's something related to national distress. Maybe there is some sort of natural catastrophe. Or maybe there is some sort of famine spreading across the land. Or maybe it's something related to social situations and diplomacy. Maybe there is a debt of honor that is due. Or maybe there is a technological revolution. You also have information on how to handle combined threats, background issues, because all of these things, you can combine them together, you can make sense of everything. And remember, this is a collaboration. The game master and the players are all going to be talking during a sort of like a session zero type of experience, where they come up with the setting, with the entire setting of the game. You also have global miscellany, with information of, for example, what is the cosmological structure. You select languages for each culture. Are demi-humans divided into specific species, or are traits passed on more loosely through generations? And then we have information on the origin. This is all about building your character. You follow 9 steps. They're quite easy to follow. First, you have character concept. You define what your character is, what sort of person your heroine is, what sort of creature is she. You have many different physical traits. You usually pick between 2 and 3 traits, and each one is composed from 1 or 2 adjectives and 1 feature. So for example, your character could have an elemental eye with horns in her abdomen. Or maybe your character has fluffy long fins. Or maybe your character has scaly rubbery legs. Or maybe you have aquatic slimy ears. So you can come up with any sort of crazy description. You do have a list of established races with different powers, recommendations of powers, moves, some sort of specific traits that specific race or species. So you have the arachnid that feel a bit like the riders in Dungeons and Dragons. You also have you could have crab people, or you could have angels, harpies, some more exotic things like the Necomata with fluffy tails and fluffy ears. Or maybe you have like wolf people, or vampires, succubi. You can come up with any character that you can imagine. They're going to feel a bit like mutants at times because of all the crazy combinations of scales and wings and feathers and eyes. But that's part of the fun of the game. Creating, for example, a Medusa that is unlike any other Medusa in existence, or some sort of mimic that is quite different from the typical chest or stalagmite that attacks adventurers in other games. You could be creating something completely original that doesn't fit any of these racial stereotypes or archetypes. There's a lot of freedom of what you can come up with. And you also define archetypes that have to do with the general direction of the abilities and skills of your character. Maybe your heroine is a sorceress, a mistress of magic and creation. You could also be a soldier or a shadewalker, which could be like an assassin or scout type of character. You also have an outlander, which is a nomad or a wanderer or a ranger. And just take a look at this illustration. This is a perfect example of how you can come up with some original things, like You sell a Lamia Slime Sorceress. You also have other things that you can be, such as, for example, maybe you are a socialite or a priest. Maybe you are a companion. This is quite different. For example, in other games, there is sort of like a general or commander type of character that gets bonuses when ordering people around. The companion actually gets an advantage when following the orders of others and supporting others. And you also have the Devourer, which is sort of like a character that eats many things. It could be anything. You could create as a character that is like a living black hole. You could create that, or maybe just a big monster. Or maybe it's just a character that has some sort of dimensional ability in her mouth and she can swallow really large things. You also have Wordlings that are kind of like mentalists. You also have the Pact Mistress, which binds promises and vows into powerful weapons. And then we have the moves. The moves are the core mechanism that you're going to be using to affect the world. When you carry out or perform a move, there are usually 3 specified outcomes. You succeed at that move, that is, you gain many cool things related to what you do, and you move forward. And then you could die when using that particular move, and maybe you are successful, but some other thing happens. And then you have failure. Now, failure, of course, could be a negative thing, but this is a fail forward type of game. So failure doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to end up, that everything's going to stagnate. Maybe you want to cross a really rickety or frail bridge and you make your check, and maybe you failed, but maybe you fell down and you stumbled upon some strange cave that was at the bottom of a chasm that perhaps you survived, and you now have a new adventure site that you can explore. Or maybe you're trying to convince someone of something, perhaps convincing them of handing out a particular artifact or giving you some sort of permission, and if you fail at that, maybe you cannot get a permission or that artifact, but you go to another quest, or you open up a new avenue of conversation. So failure here, it could carry some negative things, but it's more about adding some unpredictability to the story. This game has a lot of potential to carry out some exciting battles. They are quite freeform, but if you wanted to specialize completely in social situations, you could do that, although I recommend that you also focus quite a bit in combat, because after all, you're a heroine, you're carrying out these amazing battles that will change the entire universe perhaps. Some moves are basic, everyone can use them. Some are pretty self-explanatory, like read a person, read a situation, but there are also others such as open your mind. Maybe you try to commune with the gods or spirits or powers, or maybe you have a risky proposition. So you pick a stat and you say how to use it in a creative way, and you make a roll and you see if you succeed at a certain problem or during a particular action. You could also help or hinder someone. You could move stealthily, seize by force, exchange harm, deal harm, etc. When it comes to exchanging harm, this is sort of like a sacrificial maneuver of sorts in which you deal damage but you get hurt back as well. And some enemies are really powerful, so that's going to be useful, and sometimes it's part of another move. You also have information on the end of the session, clearing all different stats and temporary effects, and checking to see if your relationships with other characters have been resolved. If there is something that could be not exactly a negative, but disconcerting to some, is that even though the organization in this game is great, at first you get a lot of concepts and you don't know exactly what they are and how you carry out, for example, checks, but this is all covered later on in the section of the rules. So if you're someone who likes to read the system first and then more about character creation and world building, maybe you would like to begin by the rules at the middle of the book, but I would still recommend that you read it as it is designed, as it is organized, because I never felt like it was too difficult for me to understand the different concepts. And then you have battle moves, all sorts of melee attacks, ranged attacks. When it comes to carrying out these sort of offensive moves, if you succeed at them, you can choose 3 things from small menus. Because, for example, you have melee, and maybe you were successful in your melee attack, and you're going to choose, oh, I want to inflict harm, that is damage. I want to overrun my enemy's position, and I also want to grapple with my opponent. And so maybe there is this enemy, and you want to get to some behind that enemy for some reason. Maybe the floor is crumbling just beneath your feet and you want to get out of that section immediately. You damage your opponent with your spear, and perhaps you sort of like flip over your opponent quite flashy, quite spectacularly. And then you manage to grapple with your opponent while jumping. Maybe you use your spear to perform some sort of hold on your opponent's neck. So that way you decided to choose harm, overrunning, or I guess you could also outmaneuver your opponent and then grapple with your opponent. And this applies to every other attack. Because, for example, if you are performing a sort of like a backstab maneuver, you could be choosing that you are not noticed when you actually backstab your opponent. Or maybe you escape after killing your opponent, you escape the scene of the incident. But if you tie and if you fail during these different moves, you will only be able to choose some of these options. And sometimes, in the case of failure, you can only choose one, and fate intervenes. That is, the game master can insert some unpredictable and random things, even negative things, depending on the situation, of course. Maybe, for example, you are attacking with a particular weapon, you're using your two-handed axe, and you missed. So you managed to inflict harm, but now your axe is broken, and now you have to fight unarmed or look for some other weapon. And as I was saying, because combat is quite freeform, all of that related to distance and attacks, using ranged weapons or melee weapons, it depends on the situation and the types of moves that are being carried out, and special powers. And then you have a list of archetype moves. So the sorceress has things such as Sanctuary. You have a tower or a hovel or a cave that you can retreat to with 2 assistants or allies, and you can rest there to regain health. Or maybe the sorceress is a mind reader, so you use spirit instead of cunning to read a person or situation. Maybe you are a soldier, maybe you're a combat medic, you're really good at healing others during a battlefield or a battle situation. Maybe you are a specialist at using a particular type of weapon. When talking about the Shade Walker, you have some bonuses to your agility that actually gives you armor because you are so quick and dexterous. Or maybe you have a flash step. You can use melee weapons as though they were ranged. So that's really cool, and that's like a staple of anime. This character that is standing here and like kind of like teleports forward and attacks, and then goes back immediately to the original position. Or maybe if you are an outlander, you deal a lot of damage using natural weapons. Maybe you are sort of like a feral character with fangs and claws, and you attack in that way. Or maybe you are a nomadic ranger and you are quite useful when facing or navigating difficult landscapes. If you're a socialite, maybe you have powerful connections. Or maybe you are also a commander or a bard and you're quite charming when performing music. And when it comes to a priest, you could be really powerful at performing healing rituals. And you could carry out a proclamation, and your threats could carry great weight. And if you are a companion, when you follow the lead of some other character, you get a bonus when doing that. And you could be quite observant at reading a situation or a person, and you could comfort others with your presence because you support them. And if you are a devourer, you're going to get a bonus when dealing damage and trying to swallow whole your opponent. Or maybe you have a dimension belly. When you eat something, you can choose to store it rather than digest it. So you want to carry a boatload of stuff, you can have that everything stored in your belly. If you are a wordling, you could perhaps use telekinesis, or you could perform a deadly mind blast. If you're a pact mistress, you could carry out all sorts of binding pacts. When someone makes an oath or a vow or a promise, they better keep it, or else. You could also carry out some benedictions. Or maybe you are actually a truth sayer, so when you speak with someone you are suspicious of, you can figure out if that person is telling the truth or if that person is breaking her words. Now, we have special power moves, such as, for example, Bite Shake. When you savage someone in combat, you move into melee and exchange harm. Or you have some other things, like maybe your attack is poisonous, or maybe you have the ability of constricting someone, or maybe you can fly, maybe you have an evil eye, so you can deal the extra damage because of you could be sort of like a Medusa or Basilisk type of character, you could use that. Or maybe you are psychic, or you have some supernatural ability, or a great roar. You also have social moves. You could be quite skilled at deceiving others, at threatening others, or at courtship as well, at getting intimate. And then you have flaw moves. You can basically invoke your flaws to get some bonuses in some situations, and also to gain experience. The flaws help you flesh out what type of person your player character is. It all adds to the story. That's one of the things that I like of all of these moves, is that not only does it have some sort of mechanical effect on the story, it also tells a lot about your character, on how that character acts, about how active or passive that character is. You also have war moves related or concerning things such as besieging and withstanding a siege, a sortie, open battle. If you want to play sort of like a general, leading all of your soldiers or warriors or cavalry into combat, you have all of these moves to support that style of gameplay. You have like cavalry, when your unit flanks or harries an opponent, you can exchange harm and you choose two other things. Maybe your unit breaks the enemy's formation, or maybe the enemy unit is completely demoralized. You also have shock cavalry. Maybe you deal a lot of damage, or maybe your maneuvers are so great that it actually protects you from further harm. You have things such as artillery, volley, scout and range, maneuver, etc. When it comes to the list of flaws, because this game is so free-form, you could come up with any flaw imaginable, but you have some suggestions. Maybe your character simply cannot read the air, so your character is oblivious to the mood, to the situation, or maybe your character is quite cruel, or maybe you're quite impatient, or maybe you are lusting after something, or you are obsessed with something. Maybe you have too much pride, or you are reckless, or you have vanity. You also have tsundere, those characters that play hard to get. And then you have information on stats and difficulty numbers. Basically, you have a particular stat, and that represents a pool of dice. So you have, let's say, 3. That means you roll 3 6-sided dice. All of those dice that are 4 or above count as a success. So this is a success counting game. And this, of course, will surpass different difficulty numbers. Maybe there's something that is more on the heroic side of things. Just need one success to overcome that particular challenge. Or maybe there are some things on the mythical side of things, you need 3 successes. Or maybe on the divine side of things, you need 4 successes. You have information on different success thresholds and how the primary stats can be used for different things. For example, alertness could be used in situations that you require quite a bit of grace and reflexive actions. You need to be clever and smart. And when it comes to combat, you need to carry out ranged attacks using this stat. Maybe you have a lot of power. So in melee, you should be fighting up close and personal. And you're going to be quite forceful and stern when carrying out different moves or tasks in social situations, or maybe you're using some sort of skill, you need to take advantage of your power. Or you could be quite charming, quite subtle and assertive and attractive. So you're going to excel at seduction, leadership, and deception as well. So you have all the information of how all of the different stats can be used in all sorts of encounters and challenges. When you create your character, you assign primary stats. You have different number of dice to assign to all of your stats, so you can specialize in different things. Maybe you want to be charming, as I was telling you, or more on the power side of things, raw power. You could be on the spiritual side of things, quite specialized at communicating with gods and spirits and such. When it comes to secondary stats, these stats, unlike the primary stats, they do not affect the game in a mechanical way. In a way, you could say that they have some influence on the way that the rules work, but this has more to do with building the story completely in theme and making sense of the world around you and the way your character moves through the world and has relationships with others. So for example, in relationships, it could be a relationship of romance, disgust, distrust, fear. So you could have relationships between the different player characters, but also between non-player characters, some ongoing relationships, some maybe it's a relationship of between master and servant, or maybe it's some sort of hatred related to discrimination or distrust. And of course you have information on your health. Every time you get wounded, you start losing stars. And you better heal up, otherwise your character is going to end up knocked out or killed. It depends on the situation, on what type of game you are handling. You also have willpower. Willpower is basically the ability to stave off some tragic flaws. As I was saying, flaws can be invoked to add richness to the story, but the game master could also use them to challenge your player. So you have to keep in mind your willpower constellation, that is sort of like your a resource of willpower, to stave off those tragic flaws in those moments that you need to overcome your weakness the most. And you have information on how you obtain experience, because your character will develop as the game goes on, and a lot of those moments where the tragic flaw is invoked or staved off, it has to do with how you gain experience. You also have information on how to obtain gold or fealty from others. And then you determine some other things in the character miscellany, such as what types of languages your character speaks, your character's gender, your family structure, your possessions or hobbies, and of course what type of equipment you're going to use in and outside of combat, and what type of equipment you can find in different cities and towns, or maybe you obtain something as sort of like a national reward for some great task. So everything related to the starting equipment budgets and how you can obtain equipment later on is detailed here. You have information on what type of damage each weapon deals. You also have different tags for weapons. All of these weapon tags indicate some things that the weapon is especially good at, or even some weaknesses of that particular weapon. Because, for example, the dagger is quite useful to carry out sneaky attacks, or trying to target someone in a situation that wouldn't seem so combat focused. It has the qualities of hidden, and it can also be used at ranged, so it's pretty good to surprise your enemies, but it also has unlimited use. And there are some other weapons like the hammer that has the tags of melee and crushing. And there are other weapons such as, for example, the polearm that has the tags of formation, of tangle, and melee. And so you have many different tags. Some of them are magical, like the aura and ranged, so you could carry out some area of effect type of attacks using magic if you wish to. And you can actually also have tags for natural weapons. You have fangs, claws, horns, so they all have their own tags. So for example, you have the natural breath attack that can be used at ranged, and it also covers an area. And you can play around with these tags by upgrading your weapons, because maybe you want to have like a magical warhammer that when you swing it, you cause some sort of shockwave. You could enchant it or upgrade it. It depends on the story and how you are handling things, to give it the aura tag and the area tag. So you have things such as, for example, two-handed. You can make any weapon that you can think of into a two-handed weapon, so that it's really heavy. If you like those ridiculously oversized anime weapons, you can have these tags to deal a lot of damage. You have the advanced tag that makes the weapon more damaging but more fragile as well. And so maybe you have a very sophisticated weapon, but like perhaps a crossbow or a bow, but it breaks somewhat easily for some reason. And then you have other tags such as swarm. If you want to shoot like a swarm of bees at your enemies, you can do that. You also have some other tags related to blessings. Perhaps you go to some temple and you get a blessing for your weapon, and now your weapon has the thundering quality. It deals a lot of harm. It also has the tags of screaming sky and bright. And maybe your weapon is galactic, it receives a galactic blessing, so it also deals quite a bit of damage, but it has the tags of nebula, ranged, and area. Or maybe your weapon, perhaps a sword, is thirsting, so it becomes like a vampiric weapon with the tag of everblood and vampiric. And all of these tags add to the story and can be interpreted in a variety of ways. Not only in combat, you could probably think of some creative uses for it outside of combat. And so each weapon is going to feel quite unique depending on the tags that you add to it, and you can have that dream weapon that you always wanted for your character. And then you have armor. Armor will give you protection, of course, it will keep you safe from harm. It reduces damage. And you have a leather, plate, scale. You also have liquid body armor. And you also have shields. And of course, you can also improve your armor with different tags. Maybe you want your armor to be impressive, so you resist more damage. But maybe you want a really powerful armor but that is impressive but also heavy. The game master can think of some situations to make things more challenging when you have heavy armor. Maybe you need to swim or jump, and this could be a sort of hindrance. So you have other weapons such as, for example, animated. You have like an animated shield, perhaps. It moves by itself, helping you to block, parry, more effectively. You also have blessings for armor. Maybe it's a runic blessing, giving your armor magic ward, making it impressive. So in social situations, maybe the runes look really good. So that will give you an advantage during situations outside of combat. Or maybe your armor is enshrouded. So it has attacks of silken, stealthy, parry, impressive, and also protects you better. So an enshrouded type of armor would be great for a thief or assassin type of character. Or maybe your armor is made out of star metal, and it's bright and it's very good at blocking, and it has this screaming sky type of quality. That screaming sky tag is very interesting. I think you can come up with some flashy and extraordinary ways. Perhaps you go into battle and thundering with your star metal armor, making some noise, and perhaps blinding your enemies because of the bright tag, and so forth. You have information on tools, alchemy equipment, forge, the healer's bag, regional maps, star maps. If you wanted to, you could have some really interesting science fantasy adventures. Maybe you want to have battles in space and exploring planets. You could do that. And just take a look at this illustration of, it's kind of like a girl beholder of sorts. Really weird. And you also have information on resources. Perhaps you have a healer to assist you after battle, or a retainer, or a courtier, or a craftsman, and you could rule even an entire kingdom with different non-player characters assisting you in different ways, of course. So you have perhaps you could have farmers, you could have a fortified castle, you could have a nice selection of a wardrobe, or maybe you have temples and treasures are quite valuable and perhaps even dangerous or powerful. You have a lot of information on how to handle all of this, including armies. An army, or units within an army, work exactly the same as you would handle a player character or non-player character. You have information on the harm that that particular unit deals, the armor, how much damage it is reduced when they get hurt, health, how much damage they can take, and you also have a fealty rating because many of these units, when they are defeated, they may abandon you. You need to spend a certain amount of fealty to rally your troops when they are defeated and they no longer feel that they can fight alongside you. You have information on relations, on introductions, how non-player characters step into the story or out of the story. There's information on how to think of some clever ways to make a connection between that non-player character's background, their race, or their culture with the player characters. Based on different things, you can have some antagonistic or perhaps even friendly relationships with these non-player characters that at the same time make sense with the world and setting that you have created. And then you have information on the journey. This game is completely fiction driven. The story takes priority. Everything else related to rules, it just feels like it boosts the story, but it doesn't so much as support the story as it is just gives it a boost, or it creates some embellishments for the story. Because in this game you have to give priority to the story of the characters, to the way that the world develops and evolves. And all of those mechanical details are just there to further empower different aspects of the story, be it a drama, be it something related to comedy or to horror or action. The mechanics give you unpredictable things within that framework. Then you have information on how danger is limited but not time limited. That is, this is not a turn-based game. You have to make sense during combat of how things are flowing, depending on the type of actions the characters carry out, the types of special attacks and abilities. This is not exactly a game where there is a very strict initiative value. Depending on the description, things will happen. They have to make sense with the place they are fighting at. Maybe you're fighting a sort of like a citadel, and one of your characters is constantly flying and using ranged weapons. That character is going to have a huge advantage over the enemies. And unless there is an enemy that can jump pretty high or can also fly, or perhaps use some sort of ranged weapon, it's going to be the other. It makes sense that the character that flies and attacks is going to have the priority, playing the battlefield in her terms, in her own terms. Because in this game, the game master does not make rolls. In some cases, for example in opposed rolls, there will be some rolls, but most of the time, the game master announces a difficulty number. And based on the dice pool of the character, that player character is going to make the roll and see if she is successful at a particular attack or sort of like a skill check. So all of the moves are done against these enemies that the game master does not control in the conventional sense of rolling dice, choosing very specific battle powers. It's all about the character navigating the perhaps sometimes hostile world. So you have information on different roll bonuses that you can get. There's also the rolling 0d6. This is basically you roll a d6 and hope for a 6, and that will get you only one success. So you do have a bit of a chance at trying some things that your character is not specialized or trained on, but it's not exactly easy. You also have a lot of information on how some actions can be held until something happens, how to choose the right things because some powers require more specific things, or how many enemies or allies you're going to be affecting. So here's all about that, of those details. And then you have information on how to handle stacking damage, the other order of operations, etc. You have some brief paragraphs on more specific things such as negotiations and comparisons, punching, kicking and clawing, war and tactics, recovering health. Health is somewhat easy to recover. When you take damage, you lose stars, but they are recovered with per a day of complete rest unless you use some sort of special ability. Or you recover 1 star per 2 days of partial rest. So if you want to keep going and sleeping very little during a particularly arduous journey, you could just move at a somewhat steady pace and you could recover 1 star per 2 days. You also have information on how to mark experience, because this game is, as I was telling you, about the personal history of the character. And you may remember when I mentioned the flaws, when a flaw of yours is invoked, it presents some sort of challenge during a situation outside of combat or in combat, then you get experience for that because you chose to indulge in that flaw. So the game master is going to be intervening and playing around with the weaknesses of your characters to make some stories where the character is constantly struggling against a particular flaw and hopefully overcoming that flaw with time. Then you have information how to spend experience, get some new moves that are basically like special powers and abilities, how to increase your statistics and increase your health as well. All of the information concerning changing your flaws, because maybe it makes sense that in your story, maybe your character had a phobia and that character does no longer fear that particular thing, and now you change your flaws. You also have information on other rewards such as gold and fealty. If you want to be like a general or a ruler, this is going to be quite important for you. You have information on relationships, on how to craft things, how to keep balance within the game. And everything is just so simple. If it isn't handled because it makes sense with the story, that is just through the narrative, you just need to roll your dice pool and hope to get successes that is 4 or above with each d6, and hopefully you will overcome the difficulty number. And then you have more information for the game master, the fate of the game. You have information on agenda, how to complicate the characters' lives, make the first stage come alive, how to work with your players so that it feels more like a collaboration or cooperation, even though there will be challenges and danger. And then you have information on principles, on how to fail forward, how to create some grand epic adventures quest. You're not just like typical hunting rats in the cellar, you're saving an entire kingdom or an entire world, perhaps maybe the whole universe, who knows. So it talks about extraordinary deeds, how to humanize everyone, including enemies, so that there is a lot more drama. You also have information how to inject tragedy in the story, how to uncover new things. As I was telling you, the first age is an age of discovery. Then you have information on how to handle specific details, especially when it comes to moves in the game, and you have information on game master moves. A game master, as I was telling you, doesn't exactly control the antagonists. He just provides two types of moves: soft game master moves and hard game master moves. For example, a soft game master move, you describe something, but there is a lot of room for the player characters to react to that. You will be using soft game master moves for the most part. And so you present a situation, maybe you enter this sort of room, or maybe you found out that some sort of diplomat has arrived at the city and now the player characters decide what to do. And a hard game master move is usually the game master describing the event, including the outcome. This is usually a response to something that the player character has done, or perhaps if it makes sense, it has to do with the flaw of that character. So this is one of the most radical and dramatic ways to alter the story through a hard game master move. And you have examples. Maybe you start pitting your players against a great number of enemies. Maybe you complicate the relationships of the player characters. Maybe you have like a spouse and he is not too comfortable with your heroine moving around everywhere, and there is a complication in that relationship. Maybe there is some conflict when it comes to loyalties, or maybe there is a new, like a creeping darkness or hidden prophecy that suddenly appears in the setting. All of that. You have more tips on how to handle flow, threats and issues that could come into the story, how to decide the different difficulty numbers, how to not like overinflate things for the sake of it, how to reward your player characters through experience or through more material things, maybe through different buildings. Now you own an entire town or city, or maybe you have a lot of gold. More information on non-player characters, how to make them come alive. You even have a list of non-player character archetypes, and this can be used to have some stereotypical cannon fodder type of enemies. Maybe you need the heroine to fight a great number of soldiers and warriors, so you have information on armor, health, and the type of weapons that they are using. But maybe you could have extremely powerful enemies. Maybe you have a great demon or a dark god even. It is encouraged because this game, there will be some combats that are more on the demigod type of level. Remember, Heroines of the first stage, this is all about the mythology. It is encouraged that the heroines try to be clever or find out something that will give them an edge against when fighting against any of these major threats. Because, for example, maybe this dark god, which is extremely powerful, 30 health, armor 8, 15 harm and attacks at all ranges, maybe you need to find some sort of artifact that will weaken this dark god. Or maybe you can trick this dark god into doing something. You could defeat this being through cleverness, or at the very least weaken it just enough so you can have a chance at fighting against such an enemy depending on your current power level. And then you have information on the origins of non-player characters and different moves that they can use. As I was telling you, it's very easy for the game master. The game almost runs by itself, at least from the perspective of the game master. When there is an enemy, you tell player characters the difficulty number they need to overcome. to see if they manage to score a hit, and you just have to make sense of, oh, you are running around these buildings and suddenly you go up the rooftop, but this enemy jumped quite far ahead and now is able to attack you with ranged weapons. You need to get there somehow, and now you're more focused on avoiding different arrows or gunshots if you're handling like a sci-fi type of game. And later on you will have a chance to strike at your enemy, but it all depends on how the situation is proceeding. Maybe it could be something even more far out. Maybe you're fighting across dimensions. There are a series like of portals, and you're entering and jumping, and maybe if you fail a roll, you suddenly end up trapped in another dimension, and the entire campaign takes a different direction. So you have information on all of that, on how to add more elements, and especially how to add power pools and creature portfolios. You may remember that power pools feel a bit like primordial powers. They feel somewhat Lovecraftian at times. They are these strange, unfathomable pools of expression in some way, and they could serve as a source of power for your player characters, but they could also be what empowers the enemies. Perhaps some enemies worship these power pools. So you have information on some things related to that. For example, there are artifacts of doom. You have some options. Maybe you want to pick an object, maybe it's a weapon or some sort of jewelry, and you decide a doom. Maybe this object is capable of genociding an entire nation or race, or maybe it will bring about an apocalypse, or maybe it's going to end some philosophical concept. Maybe it's going to cause the invasion of an entire region. You have information on more details, more specific things as to the nature and how this artifact can be used. Maybe it has some potent magic. Maybe it summons something. Maybe it's invulnerable. And it could cause physical or mental corruption, or it has a curse. Maybe now your character cannot comprehend virtue. Maybe your character cannot abide true love. Or maybe that artifact requires just huge amounts of resources to function. And then you have to pick how that artifact can be neutralized. Maybe it's like the One Ring in Lord of the Rings. Maybe it can only be disposed of in a certain place. Or maybe you need to make a very great sacrifice to destroy that artifact. Or it must be separated in different pieces and sealed. So this is a great section to create any sort of artifact imaginable. Those artifacts that are game changers that will affect the entire world. They have information on how to handle other worlds, even though it is because the player characters and the game master create an entire setting in just a few hours. It has to make sense with the cosmology. Are there any other worlds? Is the campaign just focused on a particular section? Or is it like a globe spanning campaign, or you're going to be able to, you will have to travel through planets, dimensions and such. And maybe many non-player characters come from other worlds. You have a section detailing adversaries, the different portfolios, because all of these creatures have their own motivations and moves, and they have empowered versions or weaker versions of each other. Because, for example, when it comes to the benthic ones, that are creatures from the depths of the sea, you have motivations such as, for example, they seek to feed on the abundance of the land. And they have moves like, for example, maybe they can entangle foes. They maybe have like pincers or tentacles, and they can keep you locked in place. Or maybe they can cause floods. And you have like a weak version of the benthic ones, which is just like a hard-shelled snail shrimp. Or maybe there is a really powerful benthic one, like an armored land whale. So all of these enemies can serve for an entire story. If you wanted to, an adventure could be focused completely on just the benthic ones. Although, well, I've always enjoyed using different types of enemies, but you could do this because each enemy category is divided in weak, tough, powerful, great, and god version. It feels a bit like a video game where you have stronger versions of the same enemy, but here you can modify everything about them, physically and mechanically speaking. So you have enemies such as, for example, the corruption. The corruption is a creeping phenomenon very similar to some power pools, except that it does not grant any magical power, aura, or halo. It is purely biological. It could be a very minor thing, just like a mushroom dwarf. All of these enemies could be handled more like traps, conventionally speaking, or hazards. But for example, in the case of the corruption, maybe it could be a god, it could be a prime decomposer pit that is threatening to swallow the entire universe. You can take things as far as you want. You have other enemies such as the Gygas army, which is composed of enormous mountain-sized, heavily armored titans. They trundle across the landscape, gouging swaths of destruction. You also have some other things like the mega beasts, with the motivation of ignoring the little folk and go about its business. But they can destroy settlements and level terrain features. Not unlike the Gygas army, mega beasts are huge titanic creatures that roam the world individually. Unlike the army, they are animalistic and have no specific goals other than to consume and breed. Perhaps you could lure a mega beast against a stronger opponent to see if that opponent is crushed by the mega beast. That's the type of plans that you can come up with. And then you have other things such as the paperlings. They seek to destroy all words and languages. So the paperlings are sentient origami. Their bodies are multicolored and varied, and their leaders are foiled with gold, leaf, and marble with lapis and quicksilver. So they could be quite weak. They could just be a handsheet, like a crane handsheet made on papyrus. But it could be really powerful. Maybe it's like a glowing foil phoenix. You also have some other things, such as, for example, the pillagers. And they seek to plunder and escape. That is their motivation. They're just running around and destroying things. And they have moves such as raid and retreat, set it all on fire. They are pillagers, barbarians, and invaders that come from many foreign lands. Mostly they are technologically and magically inferior, choosing to raid existing civilizations rather than develop their own. Some groups of pillagers can be reasoned with, while others cannot. Those that can usually demand great rewards in exchange for leaving lands intact. So it could be quite weak, it could be like a skulking raider bandit. But it could be more powerful. Maybe it's a massive savage conqueror leading like a horde of barbarians. You also have the sky things. They feel a bit Lovecraftian. Their motivation is completely... Just look at this. I cannot even read this. They have alien motivations. And they have moves such as Abominable Polymorph Other, Induce Madness. So if you want to have like a Vyaki or a Migo type of creature in this setting, you can have that. And then you have more specific powerful creatures like the Ink. Creatures of the Ink are made from the thoughts and desires and crimes of civilized folk. They are curses, fears, and desires given form. Their black and purple bodies are composed of inky characters and forbidden words, and their powers are drawn from word. So these powerful type of enemies are quite abstract. They feel more like concepts just floating around, waiting to manifest in some radical or world-changing way. So you have things such as the Evening, the Everblood, the Green Tide, the Nebula, the Restless Depths, etc. Many sorts of powerful type of entities that could perhaps serve as major antagonists. Some of them are more like an organization or a collective. So for example, we have the Silken, with the portfolio of fabric, cloth, comfort, deception, refinement. They cause havoc and they make them fight. Avatars of the Silken are most often found in the harems of important folk, where deception, fashion, and luxury are at their heights. They disguise themselves as concubines and enjoy gossip and political maneuvering. So if you wanted like a character like that mythological, I don't remember the name, like the fox bride that manipulates the emperors, you could have that character. Perhaps a ruler is completely misguided, manipulated by this subtle threat. At the end of the book, you have appendices detailing languages. That is, you have pre-generated languages, and you can come up with some names based on that language category. So your character could be called Tlintha, or Ikentosia, or Pandora, or maybe your character is called Zazi, or Quaz, or Yaga. Many different names with a particular field to each category. For example, on the Runjaes category, you have names such as Wuban, Rakon, and Vunga. On the Pilgrimage category, you have Enna, Elf, and Felvori. So what do I think of Heroines of the First Age? This is a really good game. But you need to know that story is king in this game. If you're expecting to play like a tactical role-playing game experience, this is not exactly it. This is quite story-driven, and it is expected that the player characters and the game master take enjoyment in creating a world together and an entire setting. When it comes to the story, of course the game master will present different challenges, mysteries, puzzles, but because of all of those tags that I mentioned, that they have to do with the way that the story is being told, it's quite freeform. And just by taking a look at combat, when combat begins between a number of characters, the game master has to think about the battlefield itself. Maybe they are they are fighting over the clouds. Maybe in your particular setting, the clouds are sort of like surfaces and you can walk upon them. The game master could be thinking, well, now that they are fighting at the clouds, they are really up close and personal, and there is the danger of falling down. So all of that could add to the difficulty number when a particular character, for example, decides to run at an enemy or charge at an enemy with a weapon. The game master, oh, that's going to be, in this case, difficulty number 2, because you have just landed after that jump, and now it's somewhat difficult for you to hold your balance in this very narrow cloud. So it's all about visualization, of thinking, of making sense of that collective fantasy that you are creating. And this game is very versatile to have any sort of campaign. If you are not particularly fond of having combats all the time, you could specialize on, for example, social moves, and it could be more of a political type of affair or diplomatic matter. And maybe every now and then you get into combat, but it's quite easy for you to build a non-combat adventure if you wanted to, or with very little combat. So this game is a very complete toolkit for this type of mythological anime type of experience, and the flexibility as well when it comes to the subgenres that you can handle. Maybe you want to handle like action, comedy, science fantasy experience, or maybe you want things to be somewhat pseudo-historical. You could have a game like that. And I think that with all of the tools, mechanisms, and suggestions that this book contains, it's also quite worth it to have it for many different other role-playing games, even if you do not want to use the free-form system provided by the Apocalypse engine. You could use this book as a sort of source book for other games such as OVA or Golden Sky Stories, Valor, Made, the role-playing game. All of those anime type of games could benefit greatly from all of the material presented here, all of the archetypes, different adversaries, the power pools. So there are many reasons to get this book. Maybe you want to try out the Apocalypse engine with this world building system, this very strong collaboration type of gameplay. But as I was telling you, maybe you have your own fantasy game or any other genre or subgenre, and you can be taking pieces from Heroines of the First Age to create a better world. So I highly recommend that you get Heroines of the First Age. The only reason why somebody wouldn't like this if you want like a really precise simulation of battle based on real world physics, you will not find that here. This is a world of inspiration, of mystery and wonder, with laws and principles that are quite different from our real world. This is a game to create a first stage of discoveries and where possibilities are endless. Well, thanks for watching my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.